Fucking hell. Ah. Yeah, that's fine. I'll just go grab that, then I'll grab that when I need to, then hand it. How are we going? Can you hear me? Perfect. Perfect. Sorry.
Mel. Check, Mel.
Hello. Yep.
Yeah, okay.
I'm going to walk over there and sit down while you talk. Okay.
Oh, really? Okay, sure.
Oh, this is, by the way, the last slide. Just leave the last slide. It's like clips. So just leave it up.
Okay. I don't know. We'll soon find out.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to the second session today. We have Ted Colless and Leon Marvell representing the Melbourne School of Contemporary Art. Ted will speak to some of the dynamics around the school, some people that need to be recognised, what have you, and we'll talk about the structure of the event. So thank you very much, Ted. Thank you very much, Leon. Really looking forward to it. It sounds great. If we could give them a round of applause, thank you very much.
And thanks very much, Matt, and thank you very much to FOPA. I think it's a fantastic initiative, and hopefully it's going to go on and get bigger and bigger. And so, and thanks very much to all of the crew here at Testing Grounds for putting this on and getting both of us in front of a microphone on time. In my case, very rare thing. I'm going to start by saying a few words just about, I guess, how Leon and I end up here, because we're both, our teaching and our expertise comes from a variety of different university level disciplines and discourses, but most of our time has actually been spent in film and art school and things like that. But I have to say, our relationship to the art school institution is now combative, not ancillary. We have been disinherited. That's to say we're both manqué and maudit, unfulfilled and I think cursed, spat out, redundant, dissident, disappointing, expelled and exiled. And I take all of those things with a dose of pride. For us, the meaning of the para prefix in para academia is not just that of being alongside or adjunct to, running parallel, for instance, like a school of winnows feeding off a host shark by swimming in its wake and being afforded some fortuitous protection at its side. Rather than a comfortable parallelism, we would prefer going skew, which might mean intersecting the shark's path at some point, even getting in the way of the host, or veering off, which would end up meaning we either find new sources of food or we end up starving. We're prepared to accept both. I'll admit that it's not just living dangerously by Nietzsche's advice, but perversely going against the good sense of staying alive. Nonetheless, let's skew that prefix, para, to invoke what interrupts the routine facilitation of customary academic behaviour and its reward incentives. Take on that prefix by the whims of undisciplined usage rather than the discipline of its etymology. That's to say, the way it twists the word parasite or provokes with the word paranormal. Let's think about interrupting the normalising morphology of neoliberal customisation of artistic training in the new art school in this way. Under the rubrics of artistic research and the hypostasis of the word practice, and I use that word hypostasis in its medical diagnostic manner rather than its philosophical meaning, which is to say, as the gravitational accumulation of dead blood in bodily organs. So, under the rubrics of artistic research and practice, artistic creativity, inspiration, dissipation, passion, skill, contempt, devotion, and rage have all become academized as university discourse, with the quotations around those two words. Art schools professionalise the wider art world by a mode of colonisation, although in industrial terms this is probably better called vertical integration. Curators, collectors, administrators, editors, critics, journalists, as well as artists are all drawn gravitationally like dead blood toward the credentialising of their profession with research degrees and their accredited equivalents. To call this a mode of validation is like calling an invasion an annexation. I'll also adopt Matt's terminology in his PR statement for FOPA, that the academies are in a state of rot. And let's inflect this image toward the suspended rot of mummification. Guarded by a magic spell written in glyphs in the shorthand of rubrics within its sarcophagus, the art world is entombed as a universalised contemporaneity, secured and shielded by a priestly caste intoning the enchantments of zombie-like eternity. I'd like to add to that I really do think it's possible to say the contemporary is over, and I mean the contemporary with a capital C. In an odd way, out of countless cafe conversations, Leon and I found ourselves momentarily flirting with space opera as paraphernalia for our own academic exile, not to allegorise its genre, but to cross its path with reckless angles. This slot in FOPA is just a moment, so please don't see it as a preview or prelude to anything more in the pursuit of elucidating or anything didactic. It's not that the subject matter is somehow outside of academia. After all, cultural studies would doubtless consume it with the glee and purpose that a shark grabs a castaway lost overboard. Our angle on this topic is hopefully atopical. Our approach is both acute and oblique. Indulge me with an illustration, indulge my indulgence with an illustration from space travel to explain this. When a vehicle attempts to enter Earth's atmosphere, its angle of incidence is critical. If it diverges from that planned entry point by being at an acute angle, it risks burning up. I call that a meteoric flare. If oblique, it risks bouncing off the atmosphere and being shot on a path that might take it toward crashing into another celestial object, or if it misses that fate, at least within our solar system, it means going adrift into the cold depths of space. Call that an opportunity to wander. These are only catastrophes if you intend to nostalgically re-enter the flight paths and corridors of regulated airspace and traffic control of grounded earthbound institutions. I guess you could say either way, we're aware that we're not going home. Our cafe convenings about space opera swung between slandering the conformist nostalgia for home that's evidence at meta levels of space opera narrative and the big arcs in the genre, and also enjoying the prospects for encountering strangeness that manifest in the derogation of narrative duties within the genre's episodic and picaresque mutations. So here's our dispatch. Think of it as something from a couple of foreign correspondents. Thanks. I'll hand it over to Leon.
Cheers, Ted. All right, so I thought I'd begin by orienting ourselves to the concept of science fiction and this notion of other worlds to try and get some space-time coordinates. So hopefully you'll allow me to indulge that moment in a moment. But I want to start with another preface, and that is tomorrow, if I'm not mistaken, it's the 23rd of November. And 23rd of November is International Delia Derbyshire Day. And if you don't know who Delia Derbyshire is, shame on you. That's right. It's very nice. So, oh look. I'm rolling on, here we go. I'm not sure that anything's there, but hang on, the black hole is going to expand. Oh, look. All right. Now, where was I? I was, oh my God. All right. Well, I could talk about this, but it'll be really off the cuff. So, where were we? We were talking about Dear Delia, and hopefully she's going to make an appearance. Oh, no, hang on.
Hello.
We'll go back. Here now, this may be it. Oh, look, there's nothing there. Should be there, shouldn't it? If I click back one more, will it do it? Can you see it on your machine? It'll be a very dark image. Okay, so Delia Derbyshire, it's her day tomorrow. It's also, not coincidentally, the 60th anniversary from the very first broadcast in the UK of this television show. If you like, do I just press what? Hang on. Here we go. Here we go. Finally. All right. So most of you, I'm sure, will recognise this. This was the opening credits to the very first episode of Doctor Who broadcast, 23rd of November, 1964. And the reason it's also Delia Derbyshire Day is because she created this music. It's based on a tune by a guy called Ron Grainer, but you never see her credited. But she did all this work and she created this absolutely iconic song, in fact, or tune rather, which is probably the most influential piece of electronic music in the 20th century, certainly when it comes to popular culture. I'm not talking about, avant-garde electronic music, which hardly anybody listens to, but I'm talking about its influence on popular culture. So endless numbers of, prog rock bands were influenced by this piece of music. She was never credited for the entirety of the series that she was involved in, because in those days, members of the BBC Radiophonic Workshop were not acknowledged. But as I say, a wonderful piece of music, concrete and electronica, incredibly influential. So just remember, tomorrow, Delia Derbyshire, who's only now coming into the credit that she deserves. All right, here we go. Now, I think I have to double-click this bastard, don't I? Oh, no. Why is it taking... All right, I've got this intro by my... All right. Is that Doctor Who? Yes, it's the one I want. Okay.
Hello, I'm Leonard Nimoy. The following tale of alien encounters is true, and by true, I mean false. It's all lies, but they're entertaining lies. And in the end, isn't that the real truth? The answer is no.
All right. Okay, so the theme today is, as you all know, other worlds, when we're talking about science fiction in general, and particularly this concept of other worlds and space opera. So after Leonard Nimoy's intro, I'll start with this story. In the 1880s, in the United States of America, the American census was finally closed. What that meant was that every person, so far as possible, that was living in the United States in the 1880s was accounted for. All the states and their borders were locked down and tabulated. Now, this event may not seem like much to you, the finishing of the first American census, but what it meant was this, that the Wild West had been closed off. There was no longer a Wild West. There was no longer a frontier in which people could explore. There's no longer a way for wagon trains to move to that far horizon in search of a new life, because if they went through that horizon, they'd find a border, and everything had been, as I say, closed off. So that new life, that existential exploration of an alien landscape, with all its possible encounters with indigenous inhabitants, was finally foreclosed. So thus an essential founding myth of the United States of America came to an end. That is, the frontier. All heroic and epic journeys were over. a little while later, or perhaps a little earlier actually, because I think the census was a few years after this, in 1883, the Chicago World's Fair promoted and displayed new inventions, new ideas, and new technologies from all around the world. It drew in hundreds and thousands of people to see this new emerging mythology, which I'll talk about in a moment. So in the wake of the end of America's founding myth, another supporting myth began to supplant it: the story of industry, of emerging industries, the engineering of vast railways and rail networks, the creation of the electrical network in New York City, industrial science, and a new kind of hero was beginning to be celebrated. Not the frontiersmen, but scientific heroes like Thomas Edison, Nikola Tesla, and Westinghouse. So this is the background that I think is necessary for understanding the emergence of this notion that we have now today of science fiction. This is the background to the emergence of what I will call, and others call, genre science fiction. And what do I mean by that? By this I mean the kind of science fiction we are all familiar with. And it really began with one particular magazine. And it's not this one. Is it this one? Yes, it is. Thank God I put it in the right place. It all began with this magazine, and in fact, this very issue, 1926, Amazing Stories, created by and edited by Hugo Gernsback. Those of you familiar with science fiction will recognize the name Hugo because the annual science fiction awards across the world are called the Hugo Awards. So Amazing Stories was edited and created by Hugo Gernsback, and what he was promoting was this new term. He called it scientifiction. He, like everybody else in the United States, was impressed by and enamored of this emerging myth of technology and the new sciences that were transforming the United States of America and indeed the rest of the world. So what I'm saying is genre science fiction proper began with the publication of this journal, 1926. And you're saying, well, hang on, what about H.G. Wells? What about Jules Verne? They lived the last century and were writing the last century. I mean, obviously, Wells lived well into the 20th century as well. Well, and of course there's Poe as well, the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, and a host of other writers. But what they were writing is what has been called scientific romances. At least that's what newspapermen called H.G. Wells' stories. Scientific romances, or voyage fantastique in the case of Jules Verne. These writers are on the edge of the beginning of this new obsession with technology, etc. But they're a very different type of writing than what Hugo Gernsback was trying to promote. Although you will notice that in this very first issue, there were stories by H.G. Wells, Jules Verne, and Edgar Allan Poe, the three names I've just mentioned, who really are, I suppose, proto-genre science fiction writers. So it helps if we consider that both science fiction, both proto-science fiction and genre science fiction, is a subset of what the critic and writer Jean Clute calls fantastica. So fantastica is a way of representing the world, a manner of representing our world, that is the opposite of, or certainly tangential to, 19th century realism and the ascendancy of the bourgeois novel. Realism, as I'm sure you're aware, naturalism in the novel was as much an artifice as anything else, but it certainly took off big time in the 19th century, and it supplanted other modes of telling stories, other modes, other types of narratives, which Clute has called the fantastica. Clute uses the term to refer to works that were written after about 1800, when the various forms of fantastica began to be consciously exploited as a genre by their writers. In other words, writers began to write in a mode that was self-aware and signaled this awareness to their readership in the pieces themselves. It was reflexive. He suggested only after 1800 do such works take on a planetary scope, such that they are coincidental with the Anthropocene. Is it Anthropocene or Anthropocene? I don't know. It's one of those. So he's making the point that in the 19th century, the world was beginning to be fully mapped, as it was later in that century with the United States of America. And with this awareness of the nature of the world, writers began to become much more concerned with how do we represent this world to ourselves. One mode, as we all know, was the bourgeois novel, created in the 19th century. But what Clute is suggesting is that the stronger and, if you like, more aboriginal mode of storytelling, that is aboriginal to European people, is the tale, the fantastic tale. So that's my general introduction to the notion of science fiction and other worlds. And I want to move on to something in particular now, if it does it. Yeah, baby.
Everything you got.
Hear the sound of it? Yeah.
Come on, you hate. You want to live forever? Fire, Will!
Okay. So, some of you may be familiar with the film. It's a bit old now, 1990s. It's Starship Troopers, which was directed by Paul Verhoeven, a Dutch filmmaker who had recently moved to the United States because he made a couple of successful films in Europe. And it's an adaptation of a well-known novel by Robert Heinlein, one of the, I suppose, greats of the classic era of science fiction. And, of course, the novel is called Starship Troopers. A couple of things to note about it before I show you the next clip, and that is this. It was devoured by audiences in America and the rest of the world. People loved it. What they didn't seem to realize, particularly American audiences, they didn't seem to realize that the film is a critique of American militarism and a critique with America's fetishization of guns and weapons. And his follow-up two films, RoboCop 1 and RoboCop 2, again, are an thoroughgoing critique of America's obsession with violence, with weapons, and indeed with the deep connections between American capitalism and American wartime, weaponry and its arms industry. Perhaps not surprising the Americans didn't get it. But anyway, they were very successful films and a very interesting critiques of a particular period in America. It was Ted who pointed out to me the similarity with this sequence to this sequence from a much earlier film. See what you think.
Stand by. Destroy. Sergeant. Prepare. Now. Spit, boy, spit. Enough, buddy!
Of course, it's from the 1960 film Zulu. It's the final climactic battle between the imperialists and the Zulus. I don't think I need to point out the similarity between that sequence and the earlier one. In fact, I'd bet money that Verhoeven was very familiar with this film, and in fact based that sequence you've just seen. It's not shot for shot, but the idea of the massed troops fighting the massed Zulus coming over the horizon like the bugs in Starship Troopers, and the fetishization of the loading and unloading of the guns, which you saw in that sequence and you saw in the previous sequence. I'm not sure, but I'd lay money that Verhoeven wanted to do a similar thing with his film. Which brings me to the point that I was trying to make, or I'm hoping to make, which is this, that from its earliest manifestation, science fiction has been imbricated with imperialist and colonial ideologies. And not only ideologies, but the very reality of 19th century and indeed 20th century imperialism. The whole idea of exploration, space exploration, can never be fully uncoupled from imperialist desires. Remember this, I'm sure you do, I hope you do. These are the voyages of the Starship Enterprise, its 5-year mission to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life and new civilizations, to boldly go where no man has gone before, intoned by William Shatner, of course, in the original series, and changed 15 years later for a new sensibilities. The final line is finally to boldly go where no one has gone before, as opposed to no man has gone before. Gene Roddenberry was the man who created Star Trek in the early to mid-1960s, and he famously pitched the original Star Trek idea to studio executives by selling it as Wagon Train in Outer Space. And those of you who don't know, Wagon Train was a very popular television serial in the 1960s about that which I was speaking about earlier, about the American frontier of families and new arrivals in the United States traveling to find a new world in the new world. We should remember that the dream of finding and exploring other worlds is precisely an imperial dream. It is no coincidence that the USS Enterprise is a starship, not a space rocket, as this invocation of seafaring images and seafaring stories is particularly associated with genre science fiction. The Voyage Fantastique of Jules Verne, and even earlier with de Bergerac's Voyage to the Moon and the Sun, for example, and earlier still with Johannes Kepler's Somnium, which is about a trip to the moon, all draw upon knowledge of previous accounts of seafaring. This entwining with seafaring stories is no doubt tied to the romance of the great ships which sailed on navigation by the stars and the discovery of the very first New World, the Americas. Nearly all of Verne's tales as a whole transact and claim almost all parts of the globe, if you're familiar with his oeuvre. In 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Jules Verne's Captain Nemo plants his black flag, the flag of anarchy, in the South Pole, declaring, "I hereby claim this entire part of the globe." Verne's vision of exploration encompassed all parts of the world, a vision of discovery that is highly imperialized. New technologies in the 19th century and the early 20th century collapsed the distinction between time and space and the world, and was increasing as the world was increasingly mapped, as I was talking about earlier, increasingly known. Where were the new worlds to conquer? Well, the planets beckoned. Not all science fiction displays imperialist ambitions, of course, that would be an exaggeration. But from the get-go, H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds, for example, asked its readers to question the very idea of colonialism by successfully inverting British imperialism. Now Britain is subject to the colonial ambitions of the Martians, and their giant machines and deadly heat rays reflect in a distorting mirror weapons such as the British machine gun, which was used to suppress any sort of colonial revolt in the colonial outposts of Great Britain. Also, much closer to our time in terms of a critique of colonialism is Joe Haldeman's Forever War, which I'm told is, well, it's in development, has been for 10 years, but maybe will be turned into a television series sometime soon. If you don't know Joel Haldeman's Forever War, he was a young conscript in the Vietnam War and came back to the United States traumatized by the experience, and he turned it into the novel, The Forever War. Well worth reading. All right, let's move on. Again, for amazing stories, the beginnings of genre SF, H.G. Wells, Julian Huxley, four people, and there we see, of course, the Martian tripods and the heat rays of H.G. Wells' story. Oh, yeah. Gernsback's publishing also published Radio News, Science and Invention, a sister magazine. I just couldn't, I had to show you this. This comes from a 1920s issue of Science and Invention, The Vibrator of Death. The mind boggles. All right, next one. I'm just going to whip through a couple of, because I do have the time, some of the covers of science fiction stories. I wanted to say that the iconography that we associate with genre science fiction didn't come out of nowhere. It was created on the hop, if you like, by writers and by illustrators for journals like Amazing Stories and others that were generated from it. And also that there was a sort of cross-pollination between Amazing Stories and other pulp magazines of the period, particularly a very famous magazine called Weird Stories, which, as you might imagine, published weird stories, but not necessarily stories of scientific fiction. You can see the word there, the word that Gernsback created. I'll move on for another one, let's see. Here we go. Very successful magazine until this period. In short order, Gernsback commissioned a writer called Richard Shaver to write a series of stories, and the first one was called I Remember Lemuria, in which they were published as science fact. Richard Shaver said that there was a race of beings living underground across the world called Deros, and the Deros were robot beings who were controlling us on the surface. It went on for a number of issues, had an avid readership, but of course, intelligent people like I said, what a load of rubbish. And anyway, it's actually a fascinating story. The story of Richard Shaver and the story of Lemuria is interesting in and of itself, a science fiction epic. A little more. Okay, I want to talk a bit about, very briefly, the science fiction megatext. Science fiction, as you can all imagine, as I've been saying, it wasn't created out of whole cloth. It was the pressures of writing at 1 cent a word for a story for the pulp magazines that meant writers had to produce short stories at a hell of a clip just to make a living. And many writers wrote for Astounding Magazine, Amazing Magazine, Weird Tales Magazine, and a host of others, Detective Stories Magazine, Black Mask Magazine, sent a word. And if you have to write at such a clip, there's no time for you to think up a brilliant new story angle. There's no time to think up a new theme, okay? So writers were avid readers of other writers' works in the pulp magazines, and they essentially scaffolded each of their stories on somebody else's story, and they wrote it and they scaffolded their story on somebody else's. Someone had a good idea, I like that idea, I'll incorporate it, but I'll just change it a little. So science fiction, as a genre of science fiction, developed what Rudy Rucker, the American science fiction writer, calls the power chords of science fiction. The power chords are things like telepathy, matter transport, space exploration, alien invasion. These were things that were created on the hop, but they are now staples of our imaginary, our cultural imaginary. And all these tropes, all these power chords, and all these narrative architectures are what is called the science fiction megatext. And any writer today, and any filmmaker who is unaware of the science fiction megatext fails. Unfortunately, I think most filmmakers are completely unaware of the science fiction megatext, but a lot of contemporary writers are, and they don't need to go into long explanations of how a matter transporter works. We don't need to know. We know what a matter transporter is, okay, because of this megatext. All right. So let's move on to the next. Oh, this is one of my favorite novels. I put up there because it says completely terrifying. I don't know, the person who wrote that copy obviously hasn't read the novel, because it was Frederick Brown, a great writer, by the way, Frederick Brown's send-up of all the things I've just been talking about, the science fiction power chords, the tropes that were prevalent amongst pulp era. It's actually a very funny and very witty book. And it seems to sum up, to me and to Ted, probably most of you here, the present zeitgeist. Zeitgeist? That's the one. Okay. Mad universe. All right. Let's move on to this hideous image. Could have come from a 1920s cover of Weird Tales or Amazing Stories, but it isn't. As you know, it's Nick Bostrom. So Nick Bostrom, British philosopher, so-called, who's famous for his proposal, certainly in the 1990s, turn of this century, probably more turn of this century. He's famous for his proposal that we are in fact living in a giant simulation, just like the Matrix, okay? So this came on hot on the heels, this proposal came hot on the heels of the film The Matrix. But he's dead serious. Whereas the sisters, what are their names? Thank you, yes, the Wachowskis. Siblings, yes, siblings. Anyway, whereas they drew their inspiration from Philip K. Dick and other sort of aspects of the science fiction megatext, Bostrom goes all in for the idea that we must be, in fact, living in a giant simulation. Despite the fact that centuries before, of course, Descartes with his evil genie said, well, if an evil genie is in fact deluding us as to the world we're living in, how would we ever know? In the 1960s, Hilary Putnam came up with the brain in the vat Gedanken experiment, the brain in the vat, which was this updating of Descartes' famous thought experiment. And which obviously influenced the Wachowskis, particularly in the sequence when Nemo wakes up and looks down and he sees all the pods with all the millions of human beings plugged into the computer simulation. That's exactly what Putnam was proposing in The Brain in the Vat. Anyway, we can forget about that because Bostrom's moved on. He's now tied his horse to a new philosophy, again so-called, called long-termism. So, what is long-termism? I won't go into it in depth because I don't have the time, nor do I have the interest. But it's a philosophy that is strongly committed to the idea, or a number of ideas, but one that's relevant to both what Ted and I are on about, is the idea of space exploration and the discovery of other worlds to colonize. To colonize other worlds by what do you call we have ancestors in the past. What do we have in the future? Descendants? Oh, that sounds good. All right, our descendants. So long-termism emerged against an all-too-grim reality. I don't need to remind you what mad universe we're living in, but I'll give you a couple of indicators. 2020, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists set its iconic doomsday clock to a mere 100 seconds before midnight, or doom, extinction. The closest it's been since the clock was created in 1947. So we are the closest to world destruction we've ever been, according to the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. In the same year, 11,000 scientists from across the globe signed a declaration stating that, to quote, clearly and unequivocally that planet Earth is facing a climate emergency, and without an immense increase of scale in endeavours to conserve our biosphere, we risk untold suffering due to the climate crisis. And of course, to add to our woes, with the current wars going on, we still face the threat of a nuclear war in front of us. Long-termism emphasises how our actions affect the very long-term future of the universe, thousands, millions, billions, and even trillions of years from now. That's long-termism. A philosopher who's associated with Bostrom called Toby Ord. He's associated with Bostrom's an institute in England called the Future of Humanity Institute. And Ord writes of the vast and glorious long-term potential of humanity, and that it would be a tragedy if this unfulfilled potential were to become extinct, if human beings were to become extinct. For long-termists such as Bostrom and Ord, nothing matters more than the fulfillment of our potential as a species of, to quote, Earth-originating intelligent life. You'll see the snippets of this in a moment. Bostrom's argument is that, quote, a non-existential disaster causing the breakdown of global civilization is, from the perspective of humanity as a whole, a potentially recoverable setback. An non-existential disaster, in other words, one that doesn't wipe out everybody at once, causing the breakdown of global civilization, is, from the perspective of humanity as a whole and long-termism, a potentially recoverable setback. He says, and I quote, it might be a great massacre for man, he adds, but so long as humanity bounces back, it will ultimately register as little more than, quote, a small misstep for mankind. Bizarrely referencing, as I'm sure you're aware, Neil Armstrong's famous statement when setting foot on the moon's surface. He then mentions 2 world wars, AIDS, the Chernobyl nuclear accident, and says, tragic as such events are to the people immediately affected, in the big picture of things, even the worst of these catastrophes are mere ripples on the surface of the great sea of life. As long as we all, somebody, our descendants, survive to take us billions and trillions of years into the glorious future. He says, Toby Ord says, and the people who listen to him, including, you won't be surprised to hear, American and Australian politicians, he says if the Pacific Islands sink into the ocean and everybody's displaced or dies because of global warming and the raising of the sea levels, that's just a glitch in the long, glorious history of human beings. It doesn't matter. Bostrom believes that global warming, we shouldn't be doing anything about it. It's inevitable that these people are going to die, but there will be an elite. And that elite, where will they go when our planet's dead? Well, they're going to go off-planet. What do we do about a future no doubt shattered by climate disaster, potential atomic night, and millions dying of starvation and slowly cooking under the black rays of the sun?
Today, the scientific world revealed its most closely guarded secret, the plan for man's first venture into the far reaches of outer space.
Within our fuel range are the planets Venus and Mars. One of these should be our destination.
And here is the super rocket poised for its historic takeoff. And there it goes. Up, up, up into interplanetary space. And at the controls of this sky monster are the greatest scientists of this generation, Abbott and Costello.
We're not going to the moon. We're headed for Mars.
Okay. The answer for long-termists like Bostrom and his ilk is space expansionism. A small group of the chosen must colonize as much of the universe that is accessible to us, given future technological progress. Thus, the vast and glorious potential of humankind will be fulfilled far away from the dead or dying Earth. It will not surprise you to know that Elon Musk is a big backer of long-termist institutes, Bostrom's Institute in England, and similar institutes in the United States. Here you can see him before the election of Herr Trump. In his mad way, he's wearing a T-shirt saying, "Let's go to Mars." Because he literally thinks that we are going to go off planet. As Ted pointed out to me, many people think he should be the first one on the rocket to go to Mars, which is literally an unlivable planet. But no, he's going to, as indeed the long-term is saying, that's no problem, we'll just terraform Mars. Terraforming a completely dead planet is not a utopian idea, it's madness. And it gets worse.
I hereby claim Mars in the name of the United States of America.
Me too.
Okay, that was Musk at the America First Institute, again before Trump was elected. And here's the one that's most worrisome for us. I don't really have to say much more about that, I don't think. Most of you will be aware of what Ms. Reinhardt has said about her meeting with Trump and Mr. Musk. And here's my final thoughts.
Wait a minute. We can just shut off the power.
No such luck. It's solar powered.
Solar power. When will people learn?
A solar eclipse. The cosmic ballet goes on.
Does anyone want to switch seats?
Thanks very much. Well, I think we'll have a short break and then we'll invite Ted. Yeah. Very nice. All right, yes, a short break, everybody. 5 minutes, I suppose, and then we'll convene. Right. Ships, right. Okay. Yeah, yeah. That's great. And what was the film? What was it called? Message from Space.